Hello everyone, I'm Siddharthan. This is the third video in my hands-on Python course, and in this video let's understand about IDEs and notebooks and what are all the different characteristics these two kind of applications have. And these applications are something that's going to help us write Python programs. So it's not going to be like in your Python programming journey you can either learn using a IDE or you can learn a notebooks. That's not going to be the case. So in most cases it's going to complement your programming journey, because in some cases IDE is better and in some cases notebooks are better. So maybe understanding this characteristics would kind of help you to get this idea better. And once we discuss that, I'll also navigate you to the videos that I made already for doing the initial installation setup for the different IDEs like PyCharm, VS Code, or notebooks like Jupyter Notebook. So I'll mention you all those details. So let's get started. So let's talk about these notebooks and IDEs. So for notebooks, right? So we have something called as a Jupyter notebook, and there is something called as Google Collaboratory. And in the case of notebooks, we will work with a file that would have an extension called as IPYNB, which stands for Python Notebook. A very interesting thing about this Google Collaboratory is that, so we usually call that collab, and the entire name is Collaboratory. So it's Google's product, so we call that Google Collaboratory. So for Google Collaboratory, you don't have to install anything, so you can easily access this from your browser. So it can be a Chrome or any other browser. So you just need a Google Gmail account. So using that, you can just start working with Google Collaboratory, where you can just write Python programs, build some applications. And the other advantage is that they also give you GPU environment. So if you want to run some deep learning models, neural network or Gen AI models, you can run there, because it kind of provides you about 15 GB of GPU RAM. So that's one advantage. And the other notebooks that we have is Jupyter, where we kind of do the installation in our machine and we can work in that. And then we have this IDEs, or we call it integrated development environment, which is like a complete rounded application for you to do your programming. So a few examples are like PyCharm and VS Code. And one peculiar thing about VS Code is that in VS Code you can work with both .py scripts as well as the notebook. So that's like one advantage. In PyCharm as well we can do that, but for PyCharm you need a professional version where you need to pay some amount of money to be able to work with both .py and IPYNB. But in VS Code you can work with both. So that's the difference between these two, and these four are the softwares that we'll be predominantly using. So before getting into the installation part, I'll just show you the characteristics like these two types of softwares as. So first is code execution. So in the case of notebooks, right, so you can run the code cell by cell, or in other words, you can run a part of a code and then run a part of the code separately. So let's say that you have 10 lines of code. So in Jupyter, or in generally in notebooks, right, it can be either you are working in Jupyter or in Collaboratory. So you can run two lines of code first, and then you can run the other two lines of code, and eventually you can like run even the 10 lines of code as well. But you can run this part by part. Whereas in the case of IDE, you will be able to run this code at once. So this runs the whole scripts at once, but in the case of notebooks, it runs the code cell by cell. So I'll just maybe show you an example quickly. So I have my sorry, not Google Collaboratory. I have my Jupyter notebook here. So if you see, we have this code cells as you can see here, and within this we can write our Python codes. So here I've written this as A is equal to 5 and B is equal to 10, right? So I can run this and say just print A and B for me, and it's going to print that below this cell. So it says 5 and 10. So 5 is the value of A and 10 is the value of B, right? And then I'm just saying C is equal to A plus B. So basically add 5 and 10, and the value will be 15, and it will be stored in this variable C, and then I'm printing this. So if you see, this is a very simple code and has like few number of lines. So let's say there are totally 6 number of lines here, right? And we ran this first two lines first, and then like this two lines and so on. But when you write this same code on a IDE, like let's say PyCharm, so we write this entire code and it's going to run only once. So I'll run this, and first we have printed A here, and then we have printed B, and then finally we have printed C. So this entire code runs only once, and this is what we call as a cell, right? So the box that you're seeing here is what we call a cell, and that's what I meant when I say that the code execution differs here. So in the case of notebooks, you run the code cell by cell or part by part, right? Whereas in the case of IDEs, you run the whole scripts. And again, both of these has their advantages and disadvantages as well. So because of this ability to run part of the code, it is easy to test like small sections of the code that you want to experiment. So let's say that you want to quickly verify that a particular piece of code works. So instead of working on a IDE where, let's say, it's just like 5 lines of code that you want to test, but before that you have 10 lines of code, and after that you have 10 lines of code, but you just wanted to test this particular piece. So instead of running the entire program again, in the case of notebooks, you can just test that particular version itself. So that's like a very big advantage, and it's going to be really helpful when you're like doing some exploratory work in your coding. But we can't do that in the case of IDE because we can run this whole scripts. So that's like the difference between IDEs and notebooks when it comes to code execution. And then we have interactivity. So it's highly interactive, perfect for experimentation, as I said. So you can just look at the outputs in the cells below, and the other important thing is like these outputs will still be there, right? So I have this 5 comma 10 and 15, these things are printed, right? So I can download this or I can share this with anyone, and this output will stay there and they can look at it and understand the code along with the output. But in the case of script, right, so we can only share this .py file, right, and we won't be having any output kind of visible here. So that's like other thing about this. And again, it's highly interactive because of its ability to print the output after the cell, and we have this ability to understand what's the output that we get at particular part of the code, right? Whereas in the case of IDEs, let's say you have written 100 lines of code and you may kind of miss, or it might be a bit difficult to understand which output is coming from which part of the code. But that's not the case in the case of notebooks, as it's easier to execute the code like cell by cell, right? So that's one advantage when it comes to interactivity. And visualization, so when you're working with, let's say, data analysis or a machine learning or a data science project, so we often build this graphs and chart, and just like the outputs, we can print these graphs below that cell itself. And even when you're sharing your notebooks with someone else, they can also see that graph and understand that. But in the case of IDEs, when you build those same graphs, it's kind of printed in a separate window. Again, you cannot share that. I mean, you can just take a screenshot of that and send it, but as a whole you cannot send it. So that's about visualization. So we have inline visualization that makes data exploration easier. And in the case of IDE, again, we have separate window for plots, and external, we have to view that externally, not within the IDE itself. And when it comes to use case, it's best for prototyping, data analysis, and education. So again, when we are just prototyping some stuff, when we are just testing out some code, it's definitely useful. And again, when it comes to data analysis, where you have a lot of graphs and plots that you need to show, it's going to come in handy because of that ability to build different graphs, make some slight changes and run it again, and just like basically just have that graph there. But in the case of IDs, as I said, you can't do that because that graph, we are just printing it in a different window and it's not going to be retained, right? So that's the reason, notebooks are better for data analysis. And when I say education, it's basically when you're starting to learn Python, right? So it's easier to do it in a notebook environment because you can just revise it quickly. So you can just look at the code and look at the output, and it's basically easier for learning. But in the case of IDs, you just only have the code, you don't have the output, right? So it's slightly difficult when you're just starting to learn. But when we come to PyCharm or VS Code or some other IDEs, right? So where we work with this .py scripts, these are like really important. It's not like I'm learning notebooks and I'm not going to learn PyCharm or VS Code. So we shouldn't say that, because it's ideal for production apps and large scale development. And this is very important. So let's say that you're working in a industry, you're working in a company, in a project or something, right? So we just build scripts. So we don't work on just notebooks, because let's say you're building a API, or you're like building some, basically some stuff, some backend Python stuff, or even a script that's going to train a machine learning model or something, right? So in all those cases, you would work with the script, because there are some other applications, some other part of the application that would require a Python script. So their notebook won't work. So notebook is really good for exploratory purposes and for this data analysis kind of stuff. But when it comes to scripts and doing some processes, right? So let's say an automation process or something like that, your scripts is going to be the first priority. I mean, you can just do it only with scripts. And in order to get a good understanding or practice of creating these scripts, you definitely have to work with IDEs like, let's say, PyCharm or VS Code, because like all we do is like build this .py files, and we can't work efficiently with this .py files in the notebooks. And other advantages about debugging. So here I have not mentioned it, but again, a biggest advantage is debugging. So these IDEs have like very good debugging capabilities where you can locate a particular piece of code. Let's say in 100 lines of code, you can locate 2 lines of code and see how the variables are changing in those 2 lines of code. So technically notebooks also provide this debugging capabilities, but it's not like as comprehensive, as detailed as like you would see in a PyCharm. So that's other advantage. And again, if you're, when I say large scale development, again, when you're working with large pieces of code and in a company project, basically you often write like hundreds or even 1,000 lines of code, and you can't maintain that well in a notebook, because what we do is we would create separate functions and modules for this. So let's say there is 1,000 lines of code in general, just taking some arbitrary number, you would modularize this code. Like you would create functions, you would create like separate .py files, and then call these py files in a separate py file. So it's like you have 5 modules of code, and you're going to use these 5 modules in one main Python file. So this modularity kinds of helps when we are working with scripts, and that's somewhere where your IDE is going to be come in handy. But we can't like do that in IPYNB. I mean, we can import .py, but it's not like we are going to import some other notebooks into another notebook. So that's not possible, right? So that's the main difference. So when you're working on a project or something, your IDE is very important. So I would suggest you to learn both notebooks as well as IDEs. So spend a lot of time on IDEs, but just for learning and for exploratory purposes, you can definitely use this notebook. So just try to understand both. And this choice of using which notebooks or which IDEs, it's completely up to you. If you ask me, my personal preference is like PyCharm. For IDEs and for notebooks, I use Jupyter. And sometimes, like let's say, I want to share this code with someone, or if I want a GP environment, I go with Collab. But if you're working in a company, they're not going to allow you to log in with Gmail or your Google account. So Collab kind of goes away from the picture. So you can definitely use Jupyter in your local machine, and you can use PyCharm. Uh, I mean, sometimes I would feel that there are a lot of exploratory stuff that I need to do in my coding, but I also need to do a lot of scripting work. I go with VS Code because it has that, as I said, ability to do both, .py file, you can work on it, and you can also even work on the notebooks in the free version, right? So sometimes I use VS Code as well, but my first priority would be a PyCharm and a Jupyter Notebooks. That's my priority, but it's kind of a personal preference. So you kind of need to test all these applications, and just decide for yourself like which one suits your style of work. So it's, there is no hard rule on which one you should use and which one you shouldn't use, but just have a practice of using IDEs, debugging things, and so on. And also, just notebooks are like pretty simple to learn, so it's like there's not much learning curve, to be honest. So you can just like practice those things. So with all those things said, I'll just navigate you to the videos that I made earlier for doing this installation of Jupyter Notebooks, PyCharm, VS Code, and so on. So you can just go to YouTube and search for Code with Sid, which is the name of my YouTube channel. So this is my channel. So once I click this, you can go to the playlist section. In this playlist, I have a playlist called as Python installation, IDEs, and notebooks. I'll give the link of this video in this video description as well. You can check that out if you want an easier access. So you can click on that playlist and you will see all the videos. So here, as you can see, first I have made these videos on PyCharm installation, and you can basically get started with this. And I have also made a video on VS Code installation. All these are in Windows, but Linux is pretty much simple as well. So we have VS Code installation, Jupyter installation, and how you can get started with Google Collaboratory, and even how you can install libraries and so on. But these first 4 videos you can watch. If you want, you can also watch the other videos as well, but these first 4 videos are for this again: PyCharm, VS Code, Jupyter Notebook, and Google Collaboratory. So all these installations are provided in step-by-step manner. You can follow that and just do the installation and practice some simple codes that has been given in these videos. So that's the other thing. So let me know if you're facing any issues with that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about this environment setup is about virtual environment, and this is very important. like this is a critical stuff. So a virtual environment in Python is an isolated environment that allows you to manage dependencies for different projects separately. This is useful because different projects may require different versions of libraries or Python itself, and a virtual environment helps prevent conflicts between them. So this is kind of a definition of a virtual environment, but I'll explain this to you in simple terms. So let's say that you're working with different projects, and a particular project you have written this code a very long time ago, and then you have used this particular version Python 3 point Python 2.7 or something, and then you have used NumPy version of 1.114 or something like that, right? And after a year you are working on a different project that requires a different library, and you have updated this library, and let's say you have updated this Python version, and you have worked on the second project. Now, when you go to the first piece of code or the first project that you have worked on, that's not going to work because you have updated the libraries, updated the Python version, and so much things would have changed. So what we do is, for individual projects, we would create these individual virtual environment. And what happens is that, let's say if we take this NumPy library, which is basically for working with this matrices, arrays, and so on, we can have separate library version for this environment and separate library version for this virtual environment. So let's say that we have virtual environment 1 and virtual environment 2 and 3. So here we can have different Python versions and different library versions as well, and this is not going to conflict with the other virtual environment. So all these are kind of separate environment, so there's not going to be a conflict. So that's about it. So it's an isolated environment that allows you to manage dependencies for different projects. So when we say dependencies, we mean these libraries, NumPy, Matplotlib, Pandas, and other libraries you usually work with. And again, the reason is that it's basically to prevent that conflict of different versions and so on. So we create these virtual environment, and for a project we would specify, let's say, the library versions and just keep working on it. So in that playlist, I've also made a video on how you can create this virtual environment in Windows, again from the terminal. But in all these videos, right, in PyCharm and VS Code, I have also showed you how you can basically create these virtual environments, and just work there. It's not from the terminal, but also from PyCharm or VS Code. So how you can do that, and how you can install libraries. So those are also mentioned, so you can refer to that. So I hope everyone is clear with this aspect, and this is just getting started with the course, right? So once all these setup are done, we can just dive it right into the concepts and the hands-on part. So just get these things ready. So once these are like done, you can just like start with the hands-on part. So that is all from my side, and I'll see you in the next upload. Thanks for watching.